Good evening and welcome to this evening's seminar, Halachic Challenge for the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplain, Monday, April 26, 2021. My name is Rabbi Yehuda, or as many know me as Rabbi Leonard Blank, Director of Programming, Chaplaincy Commission, and External Affairs for the Rabbinical Alliance of America, and moderator for this evening's presentation. I am proud to mention we have joining us chaplains and rabbis from throughout the United States of America. Please note that all participants are muted, and should there be time available for additional questions, can only be submitted via chat or the Q&A. Questions should be submitted in English. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Rabbinical Alliance of America and the Rabbinical Council of America websites. I want to thank Rabbi Gil Student and Rabbi Moshe Shmerla for their professional expertise. It is an honor to have this evening healthcare chaplains from two of the largest and renowned Orthodox Jewish rabbinical organizations in the United States of America, both with distinguished Roshei Yeshiva and Rabbanim as their members, the Rabbinical Alliance of America and the Rabbinical Council of America. Though America is proudly part of their names, from sea to shiny sea, they both have illustrious members in other countries, and of course, Israel too. It is also an honor to have joining us this evening distinguished men and women, healthcare chaplains, also from sea to shiny sea, belonging to the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplaincy listserv, whose goals are to distribute and share vital professional chaplaincy information and comradeship between and amongst the healthcare chaplains. It is now my honor to introduce to you Rabbi Mark Dratch, Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Council of America.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this very important program. It's an honor for us of the RCA to partner with the RAA and with the listserv of the Orthodox Healthcare Chaplains to fortify and strengthen the work in the hands of you, people in the front lines, helping people, supporting them, nurturing them, helping to enhance their refuat hanefesh and their refuat haguf during very difficult and challenging times of their lives. I'd like to thank Rabbi Welcher and Rabbi Dr. Glatt for giving of their time, not only this evening, but throughout the year when people turn to them for guidance and for advice. The Gemara tells us in Brachot on Daf Hey Amud Bet, it tells two stories. One of a time when Rabbi Bar Abba was sick and Rabbi Yochanan came to visit. Rabbi Yochanan says to him, Chavivan alecha yisurin, do you like these the trouble and the travail that you are facing? To which Rabbi responded, Lohain v'lo scharan, not the trouble, not the yisurin, and not the reward that comes as a result. So he said to him, Havi li yadach, give me your hand. Yav le yadei, so he extended his hand, ukme, and Rabbi Yochanan raised him. He raised him from the bed. He helped in the healing process. The Gemara goes on to tell the story, another story of a time Rabbi Yochanan himself was sick, and Rav Chia came to Rabbi Chanina came to visit him, and it was the same dialogue. And he extended his hand, took his hand, and he ukme, and he was able to raise him and restore him to a sense of well-being. And this is the challenge. This is the challenge that each of you and each of us has as chaplains, as Rabbanim, as Jews, fulfilling the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim and being there to help other people. And the simple but profound message of Yahiv li Yadach, to extend a hand, extending a hand, being present, is something which can be transformative in somebody's lives. So that, therefore, I wish each of you a Yasher Koach. I wish each of you to be able to strengthen that Yara Chazakah, the strong hand that you have in helping so many people in these challenging, difficult times of their lives. Yasher Koach and Yara Chazakah to all the organizations that are doing the very fine work that they are doing. And God willing, you should be given the strength to be able to continue to do this fine work for many, many years to come.
It was a wonderful, wonderful greetings, remarks from Rabbi Dratch. Now we're going to have Rabbi Mendy Mirocznik, who is the Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Alliance of America. Rabbi Mirocznik.
Thank you, Rabbi Blank. Tonight's topic, Halachic challenges of the Orthodox healthcare Jewish chaplain, is a very timely and important topic. The chaplains, the Rabbanim, involved in the facilities where they found themselves, played a crucial role as spiritual first responders, especially in the scary, dark moments of COVID, which hopefully with Hashem's help, we will be leaving soon. Tonight, on behalf of the RAA, the Igat HaRabbanim, I'm very honored to partner up with the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America. We thank my dear colleague and my dear friend, Rabbi Mark Dratch, for this collaboration. We also thank our dear friend and Chaver, Rabbi Doniel Cramer, who is the chairperson of the Rabbinical Council of America's Healthcare Chaplain Committee and the chairperson of the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Litserv, for also partnering up. What we see here tonight with three prominent organizations are coming together, giving the best ideas, the best practices for healthcare chaplains to better serve our constituents, whether they are Talmidim in our schools, whether they are our parents, whether they are our congregants. It's important as rabbis to know that the chaplains, the Orthodox Jewish chaplains, are well equipped to handle halachic challenges that arise. This project tonight was the brainchild of a highly respected director of programming, Chaplaincy Commission and External Affairs, Harav Yehuda, Rabbi Leonard Blank. Rabbi Blank's goal in life, mission, is Rabbi Mirocznik with the committee to constantly and consistently to come up with great ideas to make a Kiddush Hashem and further professionalize Rabbanis and chaplaincy, and to make certain that we do our job beyond perfection as humanly possible. I want to thank Rabbi Yaakov Klaas, the Presidium Chairman of the Igat HaRabbanim, the RAA, for his encouragement and for encouraging us to proceed with this vital program tonight in partnership with the RCA and with Rabbi Doniel Kramer's group of the Healthcare Chaplaincy. I also want to thank our committee members of the Chaplaincy Commission, Rabbi Chazan, Rabbi Ivry, Rabbi Krieger, and Rabbi Silverman, great chaplains in their own rights, for working on this program. This program took countless hours, countless preparation, but above all, we thank the poskim, Harav Hershel Welcher, a great Paisik Chavetz Chaim, a good chaver of the Igat HaRabbanim, and we also thank our very own Harav Dr. Aharon Glatt, who also serves as the director of the Halacha Commission, Medical Halacha Commission of the Igat HaRabbanim, and the Chashuv Chaver of the RCA. Without any further delay, please enjoy the program tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Mirocznik, for your meaningful words and for your kind remarks. It is my honor to introduce to you Rabbi Doniel Cramer, whose multi-positions are quite extensive. He leads the RCA Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplaincy Committee and the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplains Listserv. He is also a chaplain for the United States of America Veterans Administration. He is also going to share with you a brief overview of healthcare chaplaincy. Rabbi Kramer.
First of all, a word of appreciation to Rabbi Yehuda Blank for arranging this evening. We're so appreciative for all that you've done to enable all of us to partake of these questions and answers during this COVID season. I want to acknowledge the fact that we have come a long way as Orthodox healthcare chaplains. I see amongst those who are on our list, Rabbi Brian Kinsbrunner, who I think is the latest Orthodox rabbi to be the international president of the Neshama, the Association of Jewish Chaplains. And we appreciate the fact that all of you are doing your work in helping to bring our activities as Orthodox chaplains to the awareness of the greater community. A very short advertisement to the extent that the RCA began the Orthodox listserv some years ago. And then when I realized there are many Orthodox chaplains who could not be RCA members for whatever reason, it allowed us to take the listserv independent. And I want to thank David Goldstrom, who is my technical advisor. But this is just basically a plea to all of you to be able to join our listserv if you're not already on the listserv, to participate in a given date, to be able to post as you wish, and to the extent that we can learn from each other, we all benefit accordingly. So I hope that our work as Orthodox healthcare chaplains will be able to grow as our own activities grow and our own input upon the field of chaplaincy also becomes greater and greater. And with that, I look forward to hearing tonight's dialogue, the questions and the answers, and be able to join all of my colleagues here, learning from our Gedolim who are our hosting tonight. Thank you very much, and especially again to the Igul and to Rabbi Blank for all of your arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Cramer. There are really many illustrious and distinguished rabbis and chaplains, some who are head of their rabbinical committees and very distinguished individuals. I can't mention all their names because if I would, I don't want to say I'm just choosing one or two when there's so many who are participating in this program. And now it is an honor to introduce two outstanding Rabbanim who will be responding and delving into the shilas sent in by healthcare chaplains. Rabbi Hershel Welcher is the Rav of Ahavas Yisrael of Kew Garden Hills. He is also a well-known posek. He has been a presenter and co-presenter on medical halachic issues and a tremendous resource for Rabbanim and chaplains. Rabbi Dr. E. Glatt, MD, who is the Associate Rabbi of the Young Israel of Woodmere, Long Island, New York. He is an international lecturer on medical and halachic issues. Rabbi Dr. Glatt has authored 2 svarim through Arts Grow, Visiting the Sick and Women in the Talmud, and is the Medical Halacha Commission of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, board certified in internal medicine and in infectious diseases. Rabbi Dr. Glatt is chairman of medicine and chief of infectious diseases, hospital epidemiologist at Mount Sinai, South Nassau, and a full professor of medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York, and a distinguished member of the RCA. From the onset of COVID-19, Rabbi Dr. Glatt was one of the most sought-after experts from the onset regarding the novel coronavirus on many issues, especially regarding the many shilas asked by prominent Roshei Yeshivas and Rabbanim. He also has been holding frequent informational Motzei Shabbos Zoom presentations with approximately 1,000 people joining in to learn the latest issues and concerns about COVID-19. It is now my great honor to introduce both Rabbi Welcher and Rabbi Dr. Aaron Glatt, MD. Rabbi Welcher, Rabbi Glatt, please introduce yourselves, and it's now yours.
Good evening, Rabbi Blank, Rabbi Mirocznik, and Rabbi Drach. It's an honor, in fact, to participate in tonight's forum with some of the distinguished colleagues that are involved day by day in assisting Chaplain in the hospitals throughout the country. I can't imagine at this time a greater schus to be involved in this particular Gemilas Chesed. And at least in this particular fashion, I have a small involvement in their work, and I consider that a schus. Therefore, I consider it an honor to participate in tonight's program, and particularly with Rabbi Dr. Glatt.
It's an honor as well for myself to be here with Rabbi Welcher Shlita and all the Chashuv Rabbanim that are on this program tonight. I'd like to as well the Igor Rabbanim, the Rabbinical Alliance, and the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, for putting together this program along with Rabbi Doniel Cramer and as the chaplains group and all the Chashuv Rabbanim that are here. I hope that I'm able to impart some experience that I have in the field of chaplaincy. I've been a voluntary chaplain for 3 decades and have worked in hospitals all of my professional medical career and get many, many shilas from people across the different areas asking me shilas dealing with hospital and medical halacha. And especially, it's an honor for me to be with Rabbi Welcher. We are somewhat mishpacha. My nephew is his chashuv son-in-law, and recently Muslim of the Chafetz Chaim system. So we're both sharing a mazel tov together in that wonderful regard. So, b'chavod, Rabbi Blank, thank you for putting this together. So, Rabbi Welcher, Shlita, why don't you start with the first question?
Okay, the question of where we're starting. I take the chaplaincy shilas for Rabbi Welcher. I'll start with that page. There's a rabbinic chaplain on staff at a local hospice, a couple of both Jewish and non-Jewish patients. As chaplains, we are to inquire about one's personal faith. Oftentimes, we attempt to connect patients to the local clergy. This is especially true in a case where a patient is close to the end of life and is in need of the sacraments and prayers. Is it mutter to reach out to a Christian parish and request a Catholic priest or minister to make a visit to a non-Jewish patient to provide Christian sacraments? Now, we're involved with many, many sensitive shilas. The Beis Medrash is a very comfortable place. The real world is we were challenged greatly in how to live up to our principles. And this shaila, and there were a number of other shilas that are really very similar that were asked, is a shaila that Moshe Feinstein addressed in a different venue about catering establishments. And if they could host a party in their catering establishment, well, mixed dancing would take place. And the principles that Moshe Feinstein elucidated in that tshuva are relevant to us here. We have, according to we have an Isser of Nifnei Iver, when I am the proximate cause of someone else or enabling someone else to violate an Isser. And then we have Misayaya, which means he can do it without me, but nevertheless I have a hand in it. In the Mogen Avram, as Moshe cited, is machra, and the fact that even in an Isser of Misayaya, even if the person would violate, is a person that does not observe this at all, nevertheless it is still prohibited. On the other hand, the Moshe Lum Pshat and Shach and Yehuda, that a person that totally does not observe something, there's no Isser Misayaya with this person, because it recovered. As Tosus and the Rosh say in the beginning of Masechet Shabbos, Misayaya is a corollary of Teichochim. There's no din Teichochim on a person that wantonly violates an Isser. So Moshe said that when we're involved with matters of Parnosa, that we may in fact rely upon the Shach. And that's basically whether the Jewish chaplain is going to call his Christian colleague or not to come, someone is going to call him. The family will call them, an administrator. It's going to happen anyhow. It's not going to happen because he's not going to do it. And consequently, all that's going to happen is going to have consequences vis-a-vis the job. He's not doing his job properly. So according to Moshe Feinstein, the Isser Misayaya based on the Shach does not apply in such a case, and there would be no difficulty. And there are any number of questions which are rooted in this particular matter, and especially we have to be sensitive to the fact that there is a hester because of the dark shalom that exists living comfortably with people of other faiths in a multi-faith institution. Dr. Glatt.
Okay, so I'll take, we'll try to go in order in some of the questions that we received. Some of them are specifically addressed to Rabbi Welcher, some specifically addressed to me. We'll try to make sure that we each respond in areas that we feel the most comfortable. Rabbi Welcher and I met beforehand to discuss how we would try to respond to these questions. So the next question deals with a Nebuch Shreklich situation where we're sometimes asked by Jewish patients to unfortunately assist them or to participate in them in some way. Rahman al-Islam, we're doing a cremation rather than a kvura. We all know in this group, I don't have to tell anybody in this group, the importance of a Yiddish kvura and how keneged halacha it is to do Rahman al-Islam cremation. So the second part of the question is, should we be concerned about being reported to our supervisors? So unfortunately, this has come up only too often in my experience, where you have people nebuch that are growing up either totally in a friar world, in a totally secular society. They're 100% Jewish, and they unfortunately do not understand the tremendous chiyuv and beauty of a kvura, bekarka, and they either for financial reasons sometimes or because of a desire to have an urn in the house as a constant reminder. So they choose, unfortunately, to do a cremation. So how is the chaplain supposed to respond to that? So in these situations, when it's come to me, one has to deal with this with a tremendous amount of compassion and tremendous amount of care. The potential for switching somebody from doing this cremation to doing a kvura kedas v'chedin is a possibility. And if the chaplain is able to do so, what is chus for both the nifteris, for the family, and as well for the chaplain. But it does take a tremendous amount of sometimes time and compassion in dealing with this even before the actual misa. And one has to realize that there is an obligation to try to convince the family to the point of giving them tochacha in a proper and appropriate way, without at the same time causing there to be either a chil Hashem or to cause Rahman al-Islam Eva. Now, these people are unfortunately usually in the category of a tinok shenishba. They don't understand the importance of a Yiddish kvura, but at the same time, they sometimes can be explained. And if one certainly can remove the financial constraints, there are organizations, possibly shuls, other organizations that one could possibly go to. Rabbi Zone from the Chaver Kadisha certainly is a wonderful resource in these situations if it's a financial matter. So that needs to be fleshed out early on, because if it's a purely financial situation, then you have a chance of changing the Rahman al-Islam cremation into a Kever Yisrael. When it's unfortunately either ideological or it's a tzilahachis type of a situation where the family says, I b'dafka do not want to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And this can sometimes be a situation where it's not a cremation, but they want to be buried in a Goyish cemetery for whatever the reason. So these are difficult. And I don't have a simple answer. Certainly the halacha is clear, but the care which the chaplain has to try to establish a relationship with the family and to try to have them understand the seriousness of what they may be thinking of doing. That's the job of the chaplain, and a very difficult one. I can't say that I've always been successful. It is sometimes to the point where the family just refuses to do what is appropriate, and obviously that is their choice, both b'chira chavshi and as well by American law. And the chaplain's job is not always going to be successful, but the chaplain has to try to do the best that they can. Rabbi Welcher.
No, on this score, I echo that which Dr. Glatt mentioned, that Kura Bekarka is a tremendous chus, and it's tied to our beliefs in Tchias HaMesim. It's a very central core principle of Yahadis. And yet we live in a time when people have all types of reasons, including environmental reasons, that they don't want to do Kura Bekarka. But at times, with sensitivity and persistence, we can succeed. And I've seen cases, listen, sometimes and often we fail, but sometimes rather unexpectedly we succeed. And I remember going to be Menachem Oval, where there was a person that was firmly committed, and the spouse wanted to honor their commitments, and it looked totally bleak, and yet their son-in-law convinced them that they should do Kura Bekarka, and they succeeded. So we need to have a little bit of persistence and a belief in the propriety of what we're doing. Again, not to come on in an overly heavy fashion, but to come on in a sensitive fashion. And Rabbi Zon would often say, as a very close colleague and friend of mine for many years, that what you need to talk about is not halacha, we need to talk about tradition. people can more readily, these type of people that are non-firm can more readily connect with tradition than with halacha. They haven't lived their life by halacha, but they have a certain association with Jewish tradition. And to tell them that this is the traditional Jewish method of doing it is often successful. And in fact, in the Chevra Kadisha of the Vada Rabbanon of Queens, as a significant percentage of the burials that take place in our area have, in fact, Tyra and Tachricha with a proper arm. And that's basically probably 7 times what it was 30 to 40 years ago. And the reason for that is just based on the stressing of tradition and informing people and educating people. So there is what can be done. Dr. Glatt, I think the next question is yours. Number 3.
Okay. There's a law in some states that allow for physician-assisted suicide. There's some countries that also are very strongly in favor of physician-assisted suicide, which basically means the patients terminally ill who are of sound mind can request, literally ask a physician to administer medications which will hasten their death. In New York, that is not technically legal, but what is our achrayus as rabbinic chaplains to protect these measures? So I think it's very, very important for people to understand that the secular world is changing. I chaired the committee for New York State American College of Physicians on healthcare for physician-assisted suicide. I was the lead physician on that small group with 4 other physicians, and I was the only physician that was against physician-assisted suicide. The other physicians on the group were nice, excellent, good clinicians whose, unfortunately, mores and values were based upon secular society, not based on the Torah Kedosha. And everybody on this Zoom right now certainly understands the absolute prohibition against a physician assisting in a patient committing suicide. It is ritzicha. It may not be punishable by Beis Din for various halachic and technical reasons, because the patient may be a treifa, the patient may be the one doing it, it's a gram. We're not interested here in punishments. We're interested here in understanding the halacha and understanding our responsibilities. And I think it is the responsibility of every chaplain to strongly speak out in a b'chavadika and appropriate fashion whenever these issues come up, because halacha views physician-assisted suicide as ritzicha. It's less man depolik. There is no one who disagrees with this. We all agree. Moshe Feinstein Zatzal strongly wrote this in the in his Chuvas many times. In the Igros Moshe, he writes many times that we have to do everything to alleviate suffering from a patient. And many times, not all the time, but many times physician-assisted suicide is either requested or sought or discussed because the patient is never suffering. The patient is in pain. So it's a primary imperative of physicians and chaplains as well to make sure that patients are not suffering. It's keneged halacha to allow a patient to suffer. There are appropriate uses of morphine and other pain medications and other medications, sedation, that can prevent the need for physician-assisted suicide. And these need to be adequately used. And chaplains who are not physicians, who see that a patient is suffering, should make sure that they advocate for the patient to the physicians and caregivers to make sure that the pain of the patient is taken care of. That often makes the shaila go away. Family cannot stand idly by and watch their loved ones in pain, and therefore they seek out solutions which are keneged halacha. But halacha demands that we take and address all the pain issues of a patient, and halacha demands that the patient be sedated if they're in pain. Halacha demands that you're allowed to give them all sorts of painkillers short of killing a patient, and good physicians know how much morphine you can give, in what ways, at what doses, in the proper way, that it isn't going to kill. And Rav Moshe clearly also, in the Igros Moshe, clearly brings down that you're mechuyev to give pain medications to these patients, albeit there is a risk that sometimes the pain medications can depress the respiratory drive and can, Rahman al-Litzlan, lead to a person who was in a very sick condition dying because of the pain medication. But that is never allowed lechatchila to be the intention of the physician. The physician is supposed to manage the patient to the best of their ability to keep the patient alive, and using appropriate pain medications, as with every medication, has potential risks. But especially if the patients are intubated, many of those risks aren't even concerns in terms of killing the patient. And the most important thing I can tell chaplains is to make sure that the optimal pain control is being done. There is absolutely no hospital that I'm aware of in the United States that would force a chaplain to go and do something against their religion or against their personal mores and ethics. So certainly no chaplain is going to be involved in doing anything related to physician-assisted suicide. Certainly not a chaplain that's following Torah, following halacha. And you certainly should be advocating to the family that this is keneged halacha, and this is certainly something that physicians, many secular physicians, will agree with you. When they've done polls about this in secular society amongst physicians, it is now roughly split 50-50. Physicians who are in favor of physicians being allowed to participate in assisted suicide versus still a slight majority, but it's getting close to 50-50, a slight majority being against physician-assisted suicide. And many organizations like the American Medical Association and others are still officially not in favor of physician-assisted suicide, but those numbers are changing. And unfortunately, in New York, every year there is additional attempts by the legislature to try to legislate that physician-assisted suicide should be allowed. And in all the previous years, that has been defeated. And we hope, Yezes Hashem, that will continue to be the case, because no physician, no chaplain, and nobody interested in following halacha in any way, shape, or form can believe in physician-assisted suicide. But that's not, again, it must be certainly understood that we strongly halachically believe that no patient should be in pain. And that's a halachic imperative to make sure that it never reaches the stage where patients have to request physician-assisted suicide because Rahman al-Islam, they're in such pain.
I would just add that I found in this particular area, I remember my dealings with Calvary in the Bronx, that our natural allies in this a lot of times are doctors who are Catholics. They are very, very much similar to us in their outlook and their perspective. And I was able to discuss fully and in full detail with a woman doctor in Calvary, a Catholic, and she had exactly the same concerns as Dr. Glatt, Rabbi Glatt expressed, about not causing premature death to a patient. And it's important to be sensitive to that those type of figures, the Catholic priests and Catholic doctors, can be natural allies in our work in dealing with these type of situations. Question 4, when a patient is medically brain dead and the family is requested an extubation, can a chaplain be present for that? And there are really two parts to this question. I mean, part number one to the question is, there's no point in the chaplain being present at the moment that they're going to do the extubation. In fact, it's really morally inappropriate in most situations to do so. But certainly the chaplain can come and express his sensitivity and concern for the family, can pray with them before it's done. And this is a very, very sensitive question. We have in the Orthodox community a tremendous divides over what exactly the opinion of some of the very great poskim of the last door was. If they endorsed brain death, they didn't endorse brain death. There's major debate about this. And I don't think a chaplain in a hospital can put himself into the midst of this debate. I think that a chaplain has to advise the family that's asking them that they should turn to their own halachic authority and seek guidance. And that's what they should follow. Because, as I say, it's a minefield. We know Rabbi Yosha, what he held, and he was against it. We have questions in the divide in the Orthodox community about what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein held. There's some have a divide about what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach ultimately held. And I don't think a chaplain in a hospital could put himself into this minefield until it impose his particular rule or attempt to impose it on his family without perhaps having a great deal of difficulty afterwards. So the smartest thing would be to recommend that they go to their own rabbinic authority and follow his guidance. But again, personally, I'm not one that's in favor of the definition of brain death, but one can certainly go and pray with the family. And if I would leave the room before I did any such thing. I wouldn't want to be present at the time that it took place.
I would just add one thing to what Rabbi Welcher said. I think the family is going through an extremely difficult time, as you all know, during that situation. So Certainly, if they paskin, if their Rav paskins that the patient is medically brain dead, so in New York State, there's no, quote, need to, quote, do an extubation, what we call a terminal wean. In that situation, the patient is actually dead. I would just add to this question, when the patient, this is a much more frequent question, if the patient is medically brain dead, that's almost not a shaila once they have the psak halacha. If the patient's alive, the patient's alive, patient's dead, the patient is dead. Again, as Rabbi Welcher mentioned, it's a huge machlokus amongst the contemporary poskim, and my poskim as well. Hershel Shechter Shlita and Mordechai Willig Shlita both hold that brain dead is not considered halachic death. So that's an easier question than when patients want to do what we call a terminal wean. Now that is active ritzicha. That is basically intentionally removing the tube that is keeping a patient who is ill, very seriously ill, but alive according to all poskim, according to all definitions of death, and then wanting the chaplain to be present at that time because it's a very emotionally difficult time for them. And unfortunately, I've been in this situation many times. And what I've done in these situations is that I will be more than happy to say Tehillim with the family beforehand. And even if they're not religious, they're often very comforted by saying various psalms or Tehillim. I tend to try to say them in Hebrew. As a chus, they should be said in Hebrew at the time of the Petira, near the Petira, but then I'll translate it into English. And you don't have to go into fancy translations. You can do general translations, what the capital is talking about. And I explained to them that we're davening for a Yeshua. It's a big machlokis in the poskim. Do we paskin like the Ran and the Aruch HaShulchan that you're allowed to daven for death? Do we paskin like the Tzitz Eliezer says absolutely also to daven for death? Paskin like a compromise sheet of emotion between that you should daven that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should do what's best for the patient, and that's what I usually tell them. We're davening that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give a Yeshua for the patient. That's what our Tehillim are for. It's not chas v'shalom that we're encouraging or in any way condoning the fact that they're about to do a ritzicha. But it has to be done with compassion. It has to be done with an understanding that this is a difficult time for them, and they may not be clearly thinking. If they've made up their decision, if you can't talk them out of doing a terminal wean, so then you daven with them before you do the terminal wean. And then, as Rabbi Welcher said, it's in my opinion, not the best thing for a chaplain to be present in the room. I think that, it could give the impression that Rahman al-Itzlan, that we're in agreement with it. And I think that that's that's a line that we don't cross. It's really Yaharig Yavar. We're not allowed to do Ritzicha in this situation. And again, it's very difficult for a chaplain who's been spending hours and hours sometimes with the family, helping them get through a very difficult time. And then they make a decision that's Keneged Halacha. So we have to support the family up to the point where it doesn't go against Halacha. And then we have to recuse ourselves, and we have to give them as much comfort as we can after the actual Misa, but not to be present at the time of the actual Gram Ritzicha that they're doing.
The next question, when is it recommended to stop dialysis and or peg feeding for a patient who has multiple health issues such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart failure? Well, this really is touching really on a much more global question. And the question is, at what point are we obligated to continue to treat a person? What treatments are perhaps remain obligatory almost under all circumstances? When does the halacha in fact dictate that there should be a cessation of such treatments? That's really what this question goes to. And the general construct, this is the truth of Rav Moshe Feinstein. I spent time with Rav David Feinstein, Zatzal, exploring the depth of Rav Moshe's tshuvas with him and varied issues. I've explored Eretz Yisrael or Shlomo Zalman sheet. This is very, very similar to Rav Moshe. That's personally where my axis of psak lies. And basically, if we come to the conclusion that a person does not have a long amount of time to live. In reality, that means 6 months. To gauge more than 6 months is very hard in the world of medicine to know what's going to happen. We can have a good gauge sometimes over the next 6 months what's likely to happen. And if a person is not going to live that long, we have no means of curing them from the particular illness at hand, so then we have to wait carefully for Moshe Feinstein and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach how much we should treat him. We're not there. Moshe felt to treat him when he doesn't want to be treated in such a case. And all we're doing is prolonging the suffering. Moshe even held it's an issue to do so. It's an absolute prohibition because we're causing tzar to the person. So these are the factors when we consider what we should do. Now, for example, the issue to stop dialysis. Dialysis is not a chiyuv to do dialysis. And dialysis itself is very, very harmful to the body, has very, very major negative effects. And if a person is at the point that we see that they really don't have long to live, we're not obligated to put that person onto the next treatment of dialysis. Peg feedings, there's an entire literature in the halacha about the necessity of nutrition and hydration. But that also has its limitations. It has its limitations as long as the body is able to process it. As I was discussing with Dr. Glatt in the preparation for this year, the body at times just shuts down, is not able to deal with it anymore. We're dumping fluids into a person and they can't deal with it. There's edema, the fluid is spreading throughout all the tissues of the body, spreading into the lungs, which can cause the person actually to drown and die prematurely and imposing suffering upon them. So there are those cases where it's just no longer appropriate. I mean, I had a woman dying of ovarian cancer and it strangled the large intestine. And for her to eat would have shortened her life because already she stopped eating when she had a micro fissure in the colon. And she was more comfortable and in fact lived a number of weeks without eating and without drinking. And to have done so earlier would have in fact caused a major problem which would have shortened her life. So those are the types of considerations that we have to have when we deal with these questions. Dr. Love.
So I'll add on to what the Rav just said as well, that dialysis is interesting from a number of points of view from halacha, in that dialysis is, each dialysis session, usually 3 times a week, is a separate halachic action. So a person can be on dialysis, and it was appropriate initially when the dialysis was started from both the medical and halachic point of view. And then at some point in time, if unfortunately the medical prognosis suggests that the dialysis really isn't going to save the person's life, it's just prolonging their death, so then halacha allows you to stop the next dialysis treatment, as opposed to, for example, if a person is intubated, halacha doesn't allow you to extubate the person. So there are differences in the understanding between dialysis and other measures that we do. And many of them are similar to dialysis and many of them are similar to intubation. So you have to have a certain level of understanding of the medicine before you can even pass in the shaila. And that leads me to say something which I'm a little bit scared to say publicly, but I have said it publicly many times, so I'll say it again, that it's extremely important that the family, when they seek out their Rav, I always believe, the best Rav to paskin the shaila is the Rav who is the Rav of the Niftar, the Nifteris, not the children's Rav, not the grandchildren's Rav, should be the one that knows the family, knows the situation, knows their desires, if at all possible. But that Rav, whoever's pasking these shailas for the family, has to be a baki in Hilchus medical refuah. He has to be a baki in understanding what is going on for this patient in the hospital. I tell the doctors all the time in the hospital, speak to the clergy person. Speak directly to them. Don't do the telephone and have, you told so-and-so, told so-and-so, told so-and-so. You get a totally different end result. And Rahman al-Islam, your psak could be totally wrong. And Rabbanim have to understand the limitations. Not every Rav can deal with shilas of kilayim. Not every Rav is a baki in Hilchus Nida. Not every Rav is a baki in Hilchus Kashrus. And not every Rav is a baki in Hilchus Pikuach Nefashos. And it's very important where a Rav doesn't feel comfortable that they ask their Rav or that they ask a colleague to help them out. Because sometimes I've heard families tell me, my Rav said, do everything. It's it sounds very nice, a beautiful platitude, but it's kineged halacha. It can be chovel. It can be causing yisurim. It can be a terrible, terrible thing to do everything on every patient. Every patient is individualized. Every patient needs to have halachic shaylas asked. Dr. Abraham, the author of the Nishmas Avram, he told me personally, he would ask for Shlomo Zalman every single time he had the same exact shayla. I don't do that. He told me he asked every single time to Rav Shlomo Zalman, can we do this for this patient? And Rav Shlomo Zalman, this is what Dr. Abraham told me. So Rav Shlomo Zalman said, I told you this last week. He said, that was a different patient. So I'm not saying that necessarily every Rav has to ask the posek to discuss with somebody who's a bigger Yodea safer than they are for every single similar shaila. But people have to understand that if they're not comfortable paskening a shaila, there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. And it's much better than saying doing everything. I know too many personal situations where families have come to me crying because the psak halacha that they were given is causing their loved one additional pain and suffering. And I've had to tell them, Lani Dati, your psak halacha is incorrect. Please go and ask another shiloh or let me speak to the Rav. Because the last thing anybody in healthcare should be wanting to do is to further tsar for the family. So the next question is a very similar question to this. When a terminally ill patient decides to give up on life, and they do have a terminal diagnosis, it's very important that a chaplain speak with the doctors to understand what is truly the medical prognosis. One has to understand the limitations of a physician. Physicians are notoriously poor predictors of how long a person has to live, and even sometimes is it a life-threatening condition. I have seen many patients walk out of the hospital where doctors have told me that that person's not going to make it. So doctors have to have a little bit of humbleness. I always say over the Vart, I heard many, many years ago, it says, Toshe v'rofen legehenim. The best of the doctors go to Gehenna. It's the doctor that only believes Tov is gematria of 17. He only believes that there's 17 brachas in the Shemona Esrei. Rafa'inu, that's my job. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're in charge of the other 17. So if a doctor really thinks that he is the end-all and know-all for everything, then that doctor is Tov Shebarofel Gehenna. Doctor has to have a certain level of humbleness and to understand that we don't always know. But when the doctor is saying, based upon everything that we do know, this person has nebuch, a fatal cancer, all the chemotherapies don't work, there is nothing that we can offer to this patient to prolong their life. So at some point in time, a patient has the halachic right to say, I don't wish to suffer. I don't wish to be in pain. Rahman al-Islam, somebody who has cancer pain, it's very difficult. And even if we're giving them tremendous amount of medicines, sometimes you can't make the pain go totally away. And if a patient wishes to give up in life when it's halachically allowed, so then I don't want to say we should ever encourage that, but that certainly is within the halachic framework. And if that's what the patient wants, they need to be given that option. And certainly to say vidui with the patient is 100% correct. The old Chaver Kadishas used to have the minhag that the third day of hospitalization, they go into the hospital and say vidui with every patient. Now, if they do that for every patient, so that the patients don't get upset, how come you're coming to me? No, it's not a good idea to have a Chaver Kadisha come to visit people in the hospital. It's a poor prognostic sign. But Lamaisa, they used to go and do vidui with everybody. You know, I tell patients whenever they go for a surgical procedure, you should say vidui before the surgical procedure. But I'm just having my tonsils taken out. I said it's a good idea for a person to say vidui whenever he's putting himself under HaKadosh Baruch Hu's anesthesia. He's putting himself under HaKadosh Baruch Hu's potential for pikuach nefashos. Person should realize his life is in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands. And if we acclimate patients to say vidui for things that aren't 100% clear that it's going to be necessary, so then it becomes a little bit more appropriate. I dare say that most people don't do that. And therefore, the saying of vidui to somebody who wasn't prepared that they're in a vidui type of a situation can be devastating. And there's another imperative that a physician is not allowed to do something that's going to cause a chalisha sadas. He's not allowed to do something that's going to cause a patient to give up hope. So the chaplain has to be very, very smart. The physician has to be very, very smart how they do vidui with a sick patient. And again, trying to say, I do vidui with all my patients, I do vidui at all times, makes it a little bit easier. And it's not a bad habit to get into, even if the patient doesn't have a terminal condition. But every time you go under anesthesia, anytime you're undergoing a procedure, they always have the 0.1% risk of death. It's kedai to say vidui.
I'd like to go, we have a question. Can a visitor put their hand under a sensor on Shabbos to have the temperature taken? Hospital will not let them up to see the patient otherwise. This has become particularly acute, this issue, now since COVID, that one of the measures they use to keep people that may be infected with COVID out of the hospitals is to take the temperature. If anyone has fever, they don't let them into the hospital. And there are varied sensors that work in various ways. I had this question in a hospital in Nassau County right before Rosh Hashanah that someone called me. And I will describe two types of machines, but there are other types of them. But I think this will articulate the general principle. Many places that you come into, most places, I'm not saying hospitals, but most places that you come into, they take you for you to do so with manual machines. There's some security person standing near the door, and they point it at your forehead, and they write down what your fever is, and then you proceed whatever else you have to do to get it. There are places, I came in Long Island Jewish Hospital, for example, that when you come there, you come into an office. So they tell you to go into a corner, and in the corner of the office, a big office, there's a machine, and you stand in front of it. And by standing in front of it, it takes your temperature on that particular day, and you tell them the number. Now, to my mind, there's a very significant difference between the two. The first one, where a hospital employee, presumably a non-Jew, was pointing a thermometer at you, and you just stand there. This we have a psak from the Ramah in the beginning of Shin Chavches about extracting the tooth which is infected on Shabbos and causing dire pain. And this is also consistent with the Nekudas HaKesed, the Shach and the Redeya. The Taz disagrees. The Taz holds that this type of Messiah is in fact an Yisur on Shabbos, a severe Yisur. But I think the generally accepted psak is like the Shach and the Ramah in this regard. And therefore, I called, in fact, a doctor that I know who brings a lot of patients into the hospital in Nassau County. And I asked them to intervene, and they did. And they were willing to give the security person a manual thermometer for those people that would come in and request it, because there was Rosh Hashanah. They would take their temperature manually by pointing it at their forehead, which I see as, according to the Shach and the Ramah, is not a problem. To go stand directly in front of the machine to cause it to work is also on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And Dr. Glatt did mention to me in our discussions about this is a common problem, a general problem in society of sensors. And there are many places that he told me that you go into where it automatically takes your temperature, you're not even aware of it. And I had a lengthy discussion with Rabbi Yehuda many, many years back on the issue of sensors when these types of devices started to become common in society some 35 years ago. And Welcher outlined for me why he holds that under the circumstances that you live, and those are the factors that you have to deal with, it is mutter. In fact, that we had the best of all worlds and we could shut all of them down, we would shut them down on Shabbos. But assuming that we can't, we have to go to these places where Welcher did allow it. So therefore, generally, sensors, if we have to go into a place and there are sensors, and take our temperature, security cameras that are on, etc. These are things that we don't have to be concerned about. If we have a question: can a father of a newborn wear a hospital wrist bracelet outside the hospital, or is it carried? And the question is, for security reasons, already it's for many, many years already. When my children were born, already it was in practice that the hospital provides a bracelet for the father because they want to be secure that the person that they're letting in actually is a person that should be allowed into the nursery. And particularly if you go to those communities that don't have an Eruv, and people often ask me, what should they do with these bracelets on Shabbos? And really the best thing, and I think the only real sound halachic advice that I could give them, and this is a general practice of many, is they either place it under hot water, or they take a blow dryer and they stretch the plastic a little bit, and they put it away. They put it away to hide it someplace in the hospital. They won't actually go out with it. And when they come back inside the hospital, they regain it and they put it back on their wrist and they go inside. Because this is a question of Haitzah in terms of going out in the place without an Eruv with it. And final question, and I'll ask Dr. Glatt also to answer this, please. What are the guidelines until Kohanim regarding visitation in the hospital? And this is dealing with the question, if there is a nifter in the hospital, someone that has passed away, what's the limitation of Kohanim coming in? So the first thing we need to do is to make the distinction that the Ramah draws. In Tumas Maga, there's no difference between Jews and non-Jews. Rashi and Masechet, we know that in terms of coming into direct contact with them, touching them, a non-Jew is also matami. But in Tumas Oyel, there are most paskins that a guy is not matami b'oyel. So therefore, it's preferable for a kohen not to come into be in an oil with a deceased non-Jew, but it's also it's not. So now when we come to going into a hospital, the first question is, is there a nifter there or not? And we don't always know. If there is a nifter, it's a very strong chance in many places that it's a non-Jew, because that's the basic population of the hospital. And a third factor is that in conversation with David Feinstein's Hatzal, there's a machlekes the Taz and the Shach. If the doors are not makabel tumah, And they usually use steel doors. They're not so in use in most places. They don't usually have steel doors. And the question is, they're held up by steel metal hinges. Does that cause, in fact, that the door is not a mafsik in the tumor? It is a mafsik in the tumor. And Rabbi told me that there is a strong basis to go into a hospital if one's not on the floor where the deceased is. So all of this we put together, and basically the general psak that's given is that if a Cohen has a significant need to go into the hospital, his wife is giving birth, a family member is ill, etc., then he's allowed to enter the hospital. If he does not have a very significant need, then we discourage Kohanim from going. They should, in fact, take the more machmitz out of this particular shayla. Dr. Glatt.
So I would just add to that this is a very common shayla in terms of people who wish to do the mitzvah Bikur Cholim, people who wish to do just visiting people in the hospital. They sometimes have questions about being employed in the hospital. Can a Kohen become a doctor or a nurse? These are major shaylas, and they're not simple yes or no questions. Rav Goren Zatzal, the former chief rabbi in the Ashkenazi community in Eretz Yisrael, had a very interesting tshuva that wasn't accepted. He had a whole shakel v'tarya, how you could wear a bracelet, a metal bracelet that came into contact with Tumas Mace, and there was technically, he said, no issa for you to then touch that, but since Tumah can't be added to Tumah, he held, so therefore a Kohen could wear that and somehow go into a hospital, go to medical school, go to anatomy. So suffice to say that innovative and interesting tshuva was not accepted lahalacha. And whether a Kohen can be a doctor is a very big shayla. When people ask me that, I say it's, maybe there's a different profession that you can go into. It's not to say that it's not possible. And nowadays with technology, there are actually ways that maybe a Kohen can go through medical school without actually having to touch a cadaver, and to be even in the same room with all the technology that we have in terms of virtual anatomy and virtual dissections. But it's not a simple shayla. Questions even worse, more difficult for dentists because they are dealing actually with a lot more anatomy, touching skulls, touching atzomos, and it's not a simple shayla. And again, a person who is a Kohen and has that predilection that he'd like to go into the healthcare field, Kohen wants to be a Rav, and has to go do Bikur Cholim visits in the hospital, has to do levayis. So there are possible halachic accommodations to allow it to be done lechatchila. And again, these are shaylas that should be asked well before they become halacha l'maisa questions. But for Stam Kohen to just go into the hospital, especially if it's in a Jewish neighborhood, so then already you're dealing with, if you're going to Maimonides in Borough Park, I don't know if the majority of the patients are Goyim there. It's very possible that the majority of patients are Jewish. Certainly in Eretz Yisrael, this is a major shayla. In Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, have a lot of hospitals that are under halachic auspices, so they actually have lights up and they're constructed in a certain way to know, is there a mace in the hospital, is there not a mace? The corridors are separated, there's certain tumah sof lotzes in this direction, not that direction. I think Cedar Sinai in California, Los Angeles, is constructed in a certain way that the buildings are considered halachically separate. So again, there are construction answers as well that can be done, but this is well beyond, I think, the purpose of our discussion here tonight. But it's a shayla. People need to know to ask a shayla.
Rabbi, well, did you want to do another question? We have time for a few more questions.
I think this is a very important question.
The next question I was just going to go to was, I think, something that is a number of the people asked, and that's the idea of reusing various artifacts of ritual, such as a talis, tefillin, sidurim, chumashim, tilim, electric candles, etc., from one patient to the other, especially in the era of COVID. So I think that's a very, very important shayla, but it's an easy answer. I think most of the time these aren't shaylas. Most of the time there isn't a problem. They can easily be disinfected. They can easily be cleaned. They can sometimes just be put aside for a few days, and they won't cause a problem. And the tremendous nechama that a person has by putting on a talis and tefillin in the hospital. I have had some patients, sometimes they didn't have their own talis and tefillin. They brought in an emergency. We usually have a pair of talis and tefillin in the respite room, or we get them the talis and tefillin. The tremendous, just the change in their atmosphere, the change in their personality. When they Baruch Hashem, I never missed a day of tefillin in my life. I'm not going to miss it today. And these types of things, to give a patient a tehillim, to give a woman her electric candles to light before Shabbos. So even if they have a contagious disease, sometimes MRSA comes up, sometimes it's with COVID. So there's a certain pachad involved that we just don't know sometimes. But once we do know, almost all of these things can be cleaned and disinfected in between patient usage. And there's almost no situation today that I can think of, with rare medical exceptions, where you couldn't have a religious item being used by one patient and subsequently be available to use by other patients.
I wonder if I may interrupt, Rabbi Welcher.
Yes.
Somebody did send me this important question. At the onset, Rav Welcher Shlita said one may make a referral to a priest if one would lose their job for not doing so. But on many of the subsequent questions, it has been recommended not to be involved with patients who are engaged in very common problematic issues such as physician-assisted suicide, brain death, and terminal extubation. What if a chaplain won't be able to keep their job if they refuse to be involved with all of these very common problematic issues?
Let me quote a conversation that I have with Rabbi Yoshim Zatzal on a exactly related question. The question was the following. The question was that a non-halachic congregation in Israel came to a Yerushalmi Sefer and offered him a major contract to fix the Sefer Torah that they would use in their Beis HaKnesses. And I Beis HaKnesses in quotes, in their temple. And I had heard about the Shaila from Rav Welcher, and he was not, inclined, obviously, to give a heter for such a thing. But I wanted to hear what Rabbi Yoshim said about it. So I told Rabbi Yoshim the Shaila without telling him that I already heard him sack on it. And Rabbi Yoshim told me the following. He said, if a person's parnosa puts them in a position that they have to violate the halacha, then they have to seek another parnosa. It's not a legitimate means of seeking parnosa. And all of us have to ask this in everything that we do in this world, whatever it may be. Can I be legitimately involved in a particular pursuit, profession, business, or whatever, in keeping with the halacha or not? And if I reach a point that I can no longer do so, I will quote Rav Nisan Alpert Zatzal, the great, he was a Rosh Yeshiva University, and the great Talmud of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And I remember many years ago, he said that a Rav has to have 4 pockets inside his jacket. One of them for the Piskei Din that are lechatchila, one for the V'di'evitz, a third pocket for the Shas Chaks, and the 4th pocket is the ticket to go home if the first 3 no longer work. And that's really what it is. We are not in our position is that we're here to serve the Rabbeinu Shalom and to do his bidding. And none of us want to do something which is inappropriate according to the halacha for our parnasa. And the chaplain certainly, who's representing the Rabbeinu Shalom, was the last one that should allow himself to be involved in such a situation. So, as I said, Dr. Glatt is in fact, or Dr. Glatt is presented from practical experience a great deal of chokhmah and sensitivity and how a person should deal with those issues to not wind up in that situation where he's going to be caught in such fashion that to do what he's able to do halachically and do it with sensitivity. And most of the time that should see a person through, that they're not going to get stuck in a situation where they feel they have to violate the halacha. But to violate the halacha, there's no basis. We have no right to do it. We were talking before when we talked about Messiah, that Moshe has a psak based on the shach, that there's no Isa Messiah. I'm not directly involved in doing something I'm not supposed to do. That since there's no Isa Messiah in such a case, is one thing. But if I'm directly involved, whatever, that they're only going to do the extubation if the chaplain is there. That they won't do it if I don't come. What would be the heter for me to come to such a place, to be involved? There's some dealing already with tzicha, whatever, with a very chomer dikadinah. But as I said, we hope that through such forums as this and an understanding of the issues that face us, that we're not going to wind up in such situations. But I guess everyone that's a halachic Jew throughout his life, each day has to ask himself, is my professional pursuit consistent with the halacha?
My other question, as somebody has posed, is a patient passed away in the ICU. In the same ICU was a family of Kohanim. What should they do? Can they stay with their loved one?
Pashtus form is, that if a kohen is aware that there is in that same area of the building that he's in, that there is a mess, he's supposed to go out of that area. But he has to be very, very careful about one thing. How to leave that area is itself a problem. Because if he's going to go out the same door that the mace is going to go out, then we have two malotzes. It's a shayla b'shayla, that's a deraisa or the rabbanon, but also it is. I had this problem. I designed an area for one of the funeral homes here in Queens, that the kohanim should have a place to be able to stand, but yet it should not be subject. It was near the door where they normally take the mason out. So I designed it in a way that should not violate two malotzes by making two separate roofs, that they should never be in that area where they're going, where the mace is going to come out. So they do have to be careful about that. But this is, but I would think normally that if they notice a Jew that's a goysis there, a kohen is supposed to go out. But one doesn't always know that the Jew is a goysis, that he's about to die. There was a situation, in fact, where our Shuvas at Tzarav Henach, Leibowitz, Tzadik Lebrocha, attended a wedding which took place in a hospital with a colleague of mine that was dying. And the chasana, it took place in a hospital. It ended at 2 a.m. And my colleague died about 2:25 in the morning. So people afterwards, the Rosh was a kohen, how he was there. The person was obviously a goysis. The answer was he wasn't obviously a goysis. No one anticipated that he's going to die so shortly after this wedding. He figured he had another number of days to live. So we don't always know when a person's a goysis, but if a kohen becomes aware that there's a goysis, that he's really obligated to leave at that point and not wait until the point that there's a problem of two.
But if for some reason there was...
If I could, Rabbi, let me just add, just add one thing to what Rabbi Welcher just said. It's another important caveat. The only exception that I would say is if the person that the kohen is visiting is desperately in need of the kohen being there. So for argument's sake, it usually doesn't happen this way, but let's say a woman who is pregnant and she's giving birth, and if her husband isn't there, it's going to cause her to have a tremendous chalisha sadas. So then you're allowed to even be Mechal Shabbos, to have the husband come in to be with his wife, for that example, or any other similar example where if the patient is going to have a tremendous chalisha sadas by not having their loved one there with them, so then if you can be Mechal Shabbos, you can also be, if you're a Kohen, you can also be there present when the tumah is present. Again, you can't just say this is a blanket heter. It has to be real. It has to be a very specific situation, but that's a potential heter as well, albeit not a very common one. I just did one other thing. I had the chus to speak to Rav Weiss, Shlita, about the question where physicians in Canada were told that if they don't deal with physician-assisted suicide, they must refer the patient to somebody that will do the physician-assisted suicide, or in a situation where the physician will be involved with a what we call a terminal wean. So he felt that the physician is allowed to go and refer in that situation to somebody else. They can't do it, of course, themselves, but they would be allowed to refer it to somebody else because you're not mechuyev to lose your job for that type of an issue of misayeya. So that's just to add on to what Rabbi Welcher said.
There's a very important question I do want to address. If one gets released from the hospital, can one go home on Shabbos? How should one go home? Should a family member go with the patient? And hospitals are dangerous places, particularly now in the time of COVID, but in general, dangerous places. There are all types of staph infections, for example, which take place in hospitals, but don't take place anywhere else. And in fact, the highest aspect in the hospitals raising their care today is what to do about mitigating cross-infection of patients and causing patients to catch infections in the hospital. This is one of the foremost things that the hospitals are doing today, working very, very hard to lessen this particular problem. And consequently, when people are released from the hospital on Shabbos, I generally tell them that they should have the desk call a taxi for them and they should go home. They should not stay in the hospital. It's at the very end of Shabbos, so it's okay. They're waiting a very short time. I wouldn't send them home. But if any significant amount of time, over I tell them to take a taxi and go home on Shabbos. And should a family member accompany them, and I say a family member must always accompany a person. A person that's ill is not in a situation to take care of himself. So who's going to take care of him? So cab driver who maybe speaks English, doesn't speak English, has no understanding of what the medical condition of this person is. It's an impossibility. So I always say that one family member should accompany a person that's either going to the hospital, coming from the hospital, that's in the hospital. And I paskined, in fact, many, many years ago, that someone that had his wife was giving birth and that he should go to the hospital by whatever means he has to get there, including, in fact, if it involved direct Chol Shabbos, if he had no yontif, if it was Rosh Hashanah, in fact, if he had no other means of getting there except by driving, they couldn't get there by a taxi for some reason, he should still go there. Because a person in that situation, where they're going through a medical procedure, particularly a Pikuach Nefesh procedure, is not in a situation to make proper decisions for themselves and to be their own advocate. And they should not be there without having someone, in fact, to be their advocate. And if a situation does arise, to do appropriate consultations that they are not in a position to do, to decide what the next step in the treatment should be. So these are very sensitive issues, but very important issues of being careful not to stay too long in a hospital when one doesn't have to, because they are dangerous places, and particularly today. And that a family member should always accompany someone to the hospital, out of the hospital, and in the hospital.
And I would add as much as possible in the hospital too, because things happen in hospitals. We all know that humans are humans, and it's always good to have somebody watching and making sure as best as possible. And I would only extremely second what Rabbi Welcher said in terms of hospitals being a dangerous place. My entire career is essentially telling people not to get infections in hospitals. And the only way you can guarantee that you won't get a bad infection as a hospital is not to be in the hospital. And if I'll just conclude with one last question that we had that a number of the people submitted in terms of vaccination. So it's one of the most important areas of medicine is HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the ability to prevent infections. It says, Kol hamachla shasamti b'mitzrayim lo asim alecha. That's one of the reasons why we have all the different Tanoim saying how many makas there were in Mitzrayim. Why we get 250, 200, what difference does it make? So the answer is that preventative medicine is the best eitzah, and we want to have all the machlas that in Mitzrayim, so therefore we prevent them from occurring to us by saying that they were in Mitzrayim, because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, every machla that I gave you in Mitzrayim, I won't bring to you. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu sometimes brings difficult situations for Klal Yisrael. And it always seems to be, especially for Klal Yisrael, with flu vaccinations. Nebuch, we've seen many people in our communities who didn't vaccinate, Rahman al-Litzlan, have problems. We've seen it with measles, and we see it with COVID. And there are unbelievable benefits to the vaccines. I'm not saying everybody should get every vaccine, but one of the questions is this: are there legitimate reasons not to get vaccinated? So the only legitimate reasons are the medical contraindications. There are true and appropriate medical contraindications to some vaccines. Some vaccinations are just not indicated. Some vaccines are indicated, but not for this particular person. When it comes to something which is dealing with population, hatzalas nefashos, when you're dealing with you're getting sick, could impact many, many, many other Yiddish lives, non-Yiddish lives, from getting sick, and the ava that could lead to, and the fear that Goyim would have of us, and the ava that could lead to, as it unfortunately was shown clearly with measles and other situations. If it became known that the Jewish people don't vaccinate, this would be a terrible, terrible blemish on us. And in fact, many, many great poskim say not only is it strongly suggested to vaccinate, the great poskim that came out with the COVID vaccination, for example, but as well with others, it's a chiyuv to get vaccinated. So each vaccine needs to be looked at individually. But to have people sign an attestation that say it's against Jewish law to get vaccinated, so that's Lanias Dati, that's Sheker. The Tiferes Yisrael already 200 years ago, and others, great Gedolim from the previous generations, they all said that there's a halachic allowance, if not a chiyuv, but certainly a halachic allowance to get vaccinated. And in many states, you have to sign a document to say that it's against your religion to get vaccinated. I don't know how somebody can sign a document like that. They choose not to get vaccinated. So that's, again, part of Bechira Chavshi. It's a mistake, but that's Bechira Chavshi. but I think we have to be ehrlich. That's the last comment that I wanted to make for chaplains.
I want to
Yeah.
thank both
Chaplains,
of you.
let me just add one last thing. I'm sorry. I
Sure.
want to say to chaplains, you do HaKadosh Baruch Hu's work, and I'm in awe of so many of you that you, with COVID, you went into rooms. You weren't doctors. You didn't necessarily have to go in, and yet you went in and you did so many wonderful things. Kol hakavod.
On behalf of Rabbi Mark Dratch, Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Council of America, Rabbi Mendy Mirocznik, Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, Rabbi Doniel Cramer, Chairperson of the RCA Healthcare Chaplaincy Committee and the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplains Listserv, Rabbi Michal Chazan, Rabbi Dr. Hillel Fox, Rabbi Yochanan Ivry, Rabbi David Keen, Rabbi Tzefania Krieger, and Rabbi Simcha Silverman of the RAA Chaplaincy Commission want to thank Rabbi Hershel Welcher and Rabbi Dr. Aaron Glatt, MD, for their superb presentations, and to everyone for joining us for this evening's seminar, Halachic Challenges of the Orthodox Healthcare Jewish Chaplain. For additional information about the RCA, RAA, or listserv, or how to contact Rabbi Welcher or Rabbi Dr. Glatt, please send me your request to my email address, rablenblank@gmail.com, rablenblank@gmail.com. This is Rabbi Yehuda Blank, Director of Programming, Chaplaincy Commission, and External Affairs for the Rabbinical Alliance of America, saying good night.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Blank.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. It's been a pleasure being with you. And may the Rabbi Shalom give you all bracha on your very significant awareness of English.
Rabbi mentioned that the recording will be on the websites of both the RCA and RAA. So this will be accessible to others.
And as I said, we hope we'll have a follow-up, as with Hashem. Thank you.
Thank you, Rav Blank. Thank you, Rav Kramer. Thank you, Rav Bonim. Have a good night.
Good night. And my email, you can see the entire flyer. My email is rablenblank@gmail.com. rablenblank@gmail.com. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.